Mr. Chairman, what do you mean by the planning perimeter?
The perimeter that these folks are mapping for us.
But that's not set yet.
Well, this is true. But what we've seen so far is a mile plus or minus. So anyway, I just thought that let's all be clear who's looking at something that may impact them directly and who is not. Mr. Thine would be within that perimeter, for what it's worth. Okay. So this is as much a discussion as we've been asked to sit for a presentation by the county and city consultants, which we will certainly do. What kind of time are we thinking of?
I would say about a 15-minute presentation and a question and answer period. I mean, I could imagine it going for 35, 45 minutes easily.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether to anticipate a lot of public participation or not. We were all, I would say all, I was impressed by the level of interest in the public meeting at the rec center, and thought that perhaps we should prepare ourselves for something similar as we wade into this and limit or put sideboards on public comments accordingly, but perhaps that won't be necessary. So we've got time to do that. But after Cameron's through, then we'll certainly, if there are public that are interested, we'll give them this opportunity to ask some questions from which we all might benefit. So any other preliminary matters to take care of, gentlemen? Okay, Cameron, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission for having us here tonight. I'm Cameron Gloss with the firm Logan Simpson, and our office is in Fort Collins. We work throughout the Rocky Mountains West, and I am joined by Melissa Ruth, one of my colleagues, who has been sort of the principal author of the zoning code portion of this project. So I'm just going to be going through a very brief presentation with you all this evening to give you a status report. We're very close to having the public review draft completed. There are 3 components to that draft we'll be going over tonight. We really had hoped to have it issued by now, but we're just a few days behind. We hope it'll still be this week that we have that completed. There'll be one small sort of minor subcomponent that will not be complete. That's the physical impact analysis. We're still awaiting that conclusion. So I'm just going to get right into it. I don't know if I could, perhaps you want to give that to me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Well, it's not. Go over it. Right. Scroll. If it scrolls. Here, let me get you on that for you, because I can see where the thing is. Maybe. Just now, if you click it, I think it'll go forward. Well, maybe not.
You could just feed slides for it.
Okay, give me just a second. We're having an issue here because it's working on my computer, just not on the screen. Oh, I think I had it paused. Okay, very good.
So as I mentioned, there are 3 components we're going to talk about tonight. First is the growth plan itself. Then we're going to go into discussion about the zoning resolution. This primarily impacts the county. And then intergovernmental agreement that would basically solidify and have a sort of a binding connection between the plan and the code recommendations. And this would be a agreement between the city and the county.
Okay. How about you just tell me when to.
Well, at least we get to see Morrow this way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so with the growth plan, we essentially got a statement within the plan of the direction that the community be heading in terms of the overall pattern of land use and development. And the geographic boundary actually goes beyond 1 mile. That's sort of the present level of review, at least until very recently, whereby development plans that would be happening in the county would be referred to the city for review and comment. But we're actually talking about making some expansion to that boundary. And we talked about that in some past presentations, but we'll go over that a little bit more. But the pattern of development basically would do a few things. First, it would incentivize, by the way the area is laid out, growth that's occurring in sort of in a denser fashion would be around the existing city. So that would be closer to the built-up portions of the community, and it would be less dense as you went further out. Just as a general comment, as you get out to the farthest reaches of the, I'll call it the planning area, the growth area, that's where you'd see actually relatively low density. And you already have a pattern out there that is semi-rural, and we would imagine for that to continue. There is some development pressure in that area, and we would be imagining that you'd have some techniques like the clustering of subdivisions, where you have more open space retained, part of the subdivision design, as a way to retain that rural character. And then I think very important to be staging the provision of urban services over time, so that there wouldn't be a great burden on either the city or the county. In the sort of the short term, you have an incremental change, growth happening sort of at the perimeter of the city, greater densities, slowly moving outward, providing water and sewer service and other urban amenities, things like parks. So this is the plan, because you've seen in past meetings. We had an alternatives analysis where we looked at different build out scenarios, what it might look like, some different patterns. We went over that before. This is the Laramie area growth plan. So it's embodied in this map. And then we have an accompanying document then that explains these different characteristics. And also a little bit more about how the area would be managed over time. So with the pattern of development, what's a little bit different about I think the approach today, whereas you've got a county comprehensive plan, a county zoning code that's frankly primarily rural. You don't have much in the way of urban development and urban densities in the county. But I think with our approach, we're talking about a greater spectrum of housing that could be provided within this joint growth area. So it ranges anywhere from exceptionally large lots, we'll call them ranchettes, all the way to more of an urban single family. It could be smaller single family lots, duplexes, triplexes, apartments, more of a town-like pattern. So it's this whole spectrum. And then also some different kinds of commercial development that you typically have not seen in the unincorporated part of the county that's surrounding the city. So a little bit different in terms of anticipating this different pattern. So we did a build out analysis as part of this. Say, okay, when we look at that development plan that we just showed you, how many units could be accommodated? I mean, if you actually built it out, so we made some assumptions we kind of estimated about 80% of the parcels would be built out to their maximum capacity. So it's not 100%. So it's not the absolute greatest number that you could put within an area based on this plan. So we brought it back a little bit. We had to take out areas that would be dedicated for streets, for example. So depending on the pattern of development, obviously you'd have denser developments require more streets, more rights of way. That was netted out. Other types of natural features like floodways, those came out. So when you add it all up, you could build up to 29,000 new units. I mean, it's a big number, but you're also talking about growth that would be multi-generational based on the growth pattern that you have today, your growth rate, which is pretty consistent and has been sort of in the post-war era, if you do that, it's a lot. I won't try to pin an exact number on it because it's so far out there in the future, but it's sufficient to say that you have enough land to accommodate the community's growth for a long time.
What do we have right now for residential units in town?
Well, your population, is just over, you have less than that right now because you're 2.225 per household. That's your household size. And you have I think it's around 31,000. So yeah, it would be making Laramie quite a bit bigger if you were to build the whole thing out.
Yeah, but just to put some scale of that, it would be Laramie 2.5 times the size of it right now.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yep, exactly right. So, part of our analysis is to look at utilities, and as I mentioned, a physical impact analysis as well. The physical component's not done. The utilities had to be completed before the physical work had been completed. So that'll be delayed about another week. We'll have that. So the idea here is to take a look at the water and sewer system and identify what it would take to serve the growth area. What does that look like? So we found it's actually pretty good news. From the water supply standpoint, the community has tremendous water reserves. I've heard numbers thrown out there is probably double what is needed, which is really fortuitous. A lot of communities don't have that luxury. It really gets down to the water distribution system and what kind of investment would need to be made. So we've run the numbers. I'll show you the map here in a moment. That basically concludes that the system, as it's been designed today, existing water system, can be expanded pretty readily. You do have sort of the east-west portion of the water system in the city has got some challenges, but that can be addressed. There needs to be some upsizing in some areas. There needs to be some accommodation for grades with lift stations and pressure reducing valves and reservoirs. They'll be needed, but the total in today's dollars would be $45.5 million, which sounds like a lot, but quite frankly, when you think about this being spread out over decades, it really is, I think, a smaller number than we had anticipated. And then when you go to the sanitary sewer side, it's actually pretty similar. Fortunately, the system has been designed in a way that you could expand and accommodate growth within the existing infrastructure. You do have to make some changes in some areas. That investment is actually a little bit less. It'd be $38.5 million. And think about it being spread out, and then that cost is not just borne by the public sector, this private sector development, as they were putting in a subdivision, for example, they would have to be doing main extensions to serve it. So that's a pretty good piece of news. Next slide. So when you look at it actually mapped out, you can see that the blue on the right is the aquifer protection area. The blue lines are water mains. Green lines are sewer mains. And then you have water storage tanks that are indicated there, I believe, as squares. Then you have some lift stations that have to go in a few spots. You have a lot of pressure moderation that has to be done through these reducing valves that are shown here as well. But the system would be accommodated largely within existing and future rights of way, which is typically where you would put the mains. So I think it's all a pretty positive picture as things go. Nothing too earth-shattering in terms of the conclusion of the utility analysis. Now, the next step, as I mentioned, would be the fiscal piece. So we'll be taking the costs for service, looking at things like, obviously, utilities, folding in public services like police, fire, emergency medical, some of the other urban service costs that you would have over time. And then how would you pay for those? Given existing tax structure and fees that would be collected and so forth. How does that match up? And again, we don't have that information, but we will be folding it into the plan. So you get a good sense for, okay, what's the impact to city, county, potentially special service districts if this growth plan were to be achieved. Next slide. So going from sort of the big picture of what's the pattern of development, what's the character going to look like, is, all right, how do you go through the difficult task of amending the zoning resolution to essentially make this happen? And it's a little tricky because you've got impacts to the county organization, those that have to actually implement the zoning. You obviously have impacts to property owners that are anticipating to do development, or somebody that's already got property that's zoned and they're anticipating, I've got an existing zoning. So we try to do is simplify the process, reduce the impact to all these parties, and at the same time try to achieve this desired outcome. And it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try to walk you through and explain our thought process and how we've structured this zoning resolution change. So I want me to go to the next one. So the overarching piece of this is that the existing county zoning within this area would stay the same. But what you have is an overlay zone. So your underlying zone stays the same. So if you're not doing anything, so it's static, you have the existing property, existing development, nothing changes. If you were to be developing in this growth area, then you would be subject to the overlay and a new set of standards that would be embodied into the zoning resolution. So it's its own separate section. The other piece of this that I think is important is that you would not have to rezone the land. So if somebody comes in, they would use the overlay requirements. They would not have to go through the mechanics of applying for rezoning, which is somewhat laborious and time consuming. This way, again, lessening impact to property owners. Next slide. So the other thing that we've talked about in past meetings, and we have some questions here for you about how we might do this, but identifying cross sections for the growth area that have commonality between city and county, both from a public right-of-way standpoint and actual cross sections of the roadways. So you've seen these before. There's some that are rural, some that are urban. And the idea being as time marches on and the area grows, that these roads are going to physically match up. You're going to be able to build them incrementally. And there's going to be a logical progression from a city facility and a county facility. And it's a little bit tricky. And we're going to talk about, I think, some questions that came up, I know, last night at the City Planning Commission that I think you would be interested in hearing about, and also some just questions for you. So next slide. So the next piece of this is the intergovernmental agreement. And as I mentioned, it would be binding. Under state law, you have the authority to enter into an agreement, city and county, as you can with other special districts, and you can define terms of that agreement. So first, it would establish this outer boundary. Then it would basically commit the city and the county to agree to the Laramie area growth plan. And then it would acknowledge that the county is going to be adopting a zoning overlay for that area to implement the plan. And these are, pretty significant steps, I think, in the agreement that both parties would have to agree to. So today, the application procedure is, if you're within, a mile of the city limits, you're doing a county development, your development plan would be essentially routed from county staff to city staff. They provide comment, and that is the extent of it. There's no review authority by the city. It's not a discretionary process, it's advisory. And we have a different process now for subdivisions. So, but if you go to what we're talking about under the proposed system, you would have a referral of any development in the county to the city for review and comment. City would have no authority, but if you have a rezoning application, that application would then be sort of a joint pre-application with the city and the county staff getting together, saying, okay, this individual is going to be requesting a comprehensive plan amendment or rezoning. You would have a pre-application meeting so the city and the county can talk about, its consistency with the plan. So it's a little bit different. And where we get into, I think, sort of the details, but these are important. This is a pretty big shift that I want to discuss, is about the trigger points for annexation. I know that when we went out to the community, we've heard a lot from folks saying that they're concerned that this plan is an annexation plan. Well, the purpose of the plan, though, is to work within both jurisdictions. Frankly, in many cases, it's immaterial whether property is annexed. The idea is to have a joint plan and joint vision that can be achieved regardless of jurisdiction. However, we want to, in the draft, I think the idea is to solidify the rules for annexation and, frankly, bring properties that are eligible for annexation into the city prior to development. So under state law, if you're contiguous to the city boundary, you're eligible for annexation. If you don't have that kind of beauty, you're not eligible. And it's one where the property owner would provide a petition, it would give their consent, and it would be annexed. Right now, a developer could come in with a contiguous property and say, no, I want to stay in the county. And there's not really any room for discussion. That's at their discretion. What we're saying under this approach is that if you are contiguous, you would not develop in the county. You would go to the city, go through an annexation process, and your development plan would be processed in the city. So that is a marked difference between what we do today. The other piece of this is if you're within the growth area, let's say you're a mile outside and you have a development plan. You come in and meet with the county planning staff, you're doing a 5-lot subdivision. You're not contiguous, you're not eligible to be annexed, but you would sign a annexation agreement. That annexation agreement would bind that individual, their heirs, and any assigns to fulfilling that agreement, that at such time as they're eligible, that they would annex. And that could be decades later. I mean, if it's a mile out, who knows? I mean, it's hard to gauge how many years it would be or months, but it could be a long time. But this gives the opportunity then for that agreement to be recorded against the property. People know, they're on notice that at some point the property could likely be annexed as continuity is achieved. So that is a pretty dramatic change. Again, that would be a separate agreement. We've got a draft of that we're going to be issuing out with the other components of the review draft, just so everybody knows what the language is. I think it's pretty straightforward, but again, this is a big difference between what's been the process been used so far.
Cameron,
Sure.
is that a pretty standard thing around the country?
No, I would say it's not. I would say it's not. There are jurisdictions, I can think of several jurisdictions that have this requirement. From our estimation, this is a great way to fulfill, I think, the vision of the plan, so that the service provision for water and sewer, for the most part, is going to be the city, not the county. And that is the way that, frankly, you're going to get that extension, just like we saw, a few slides back, that system. That is a sort of a logical pattern of growth. And if everything just stays forever in the county without any kind of trigger, it's going to make it harder to get those systems in place. And that's just the truth of it. And it was a good lead into this discussion about a city utility. So right now, if your property is within 100 feet of a sewer main, you have to hook into the system. That is a requirement. That is not
County requirement?
no, this is a city requirement. So if you're
Out of city at the top. Okay, so if you're in the city.
yeah. So it's the city granting an out of city utility extension to a county property. So let's say your property, it's a county property, you're really close to the city, and you want to get service. Let's say you have a failing septic system, and you find that your property is configured in a way that you really can't, do it, or you have a desire to hook into the system, or there's a demonstrated health hazard, and you need to hook in the system. The city can require that somebody hook into the system, and that is on the books today. And 100 feet is not very much. It's just, and when we're talking about properties that can be 20 acres, 100 feet is not very far.
Yeah, I guess I'm just surprised that the city has any extraterritorial reach. I thought that the stake had been driven through that hard by those who believe strongly in it, but that's
So
not the case. That's the state statute that provides.
Well, the city has a code provision in their, it's in their utility code that does have this requirement.
But again, that sounds like a requirement of somebody who's not in the city.
Right, it's a good point.
So,
Yeah. Now this provision, because you had asked about sort of how common the annexation agreements are, this type of a standard is very common. So the notion here is to extend that distance from 100 feet to 400 feet so that more properties could potentially be eligible for hooking into the sewer system. This would not be retroactive. So if you have an existing septic system and you want to run it, continue running it, that's fine. But if you're putting in developing a property, you're putting in a new system, that's where the connection would have to be made. And that's a pretty important distinction.
Cameron, you're simultaneously making these proposals to both the county and the city, correct?
Correct, yes. Yep. Exactly right. I mean, as a general comment, I would say that, if you look at the map, I mean, the land most of the land we're talking about it's in the county's jurisdiction. So it affects the county more. I mean, clearly it has a greater impact on the county than it does.
Oh, it's all the land.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, other than some parcels that maybe are owned by the city or other public entity out in the county, I think it's, pretty much straight across. The county would be a burden placed on the county more than the city, much more.
So, not to distract you too much from your flow, but just on this point, I think every lot in the Sherman Hills and Laramie Plains subdivisions includes with the deed an obligation to hook to central sewer when it becomes available. Do those ever get enforced? Does that have any feed into this? Is there meat to that? Many of us looked at that and thought that's interesting, and I don't know that anybody's ever tried to make that happen. But have you seen those kinds of the hard contractual things in deeds of sale or enforced?
Well, it's always who's gonna enforce it.
Right.
So if it's a deed restriction, that's going to be a sort of a private enforcement, and then you always have to ask yourself, who's going to do that? who's going to be the party that's going to call in the requirement. And in that case, if it's a deed restriction, it's not going to be the city.
I don't,
Yeah,
who has standing to do that? I
Yeah,
wonder.
I think only property owners would have that standing.
But it might be relevant to this discussion.
It might be,
That those,
yeah.
that those provisions are in there and people have lived with them for 50 years now.
Yeah. So another piece of this is the street standards, and there's a lot of discussions during this whole process about the dedication of rights of way. I think it's normal and customary for the county, when a subdivision comes in, to have rights of way dedicated to the public. And that's normal and customary, but there have been some situations where it hasn't happened. And what we're saying here is that it would solidify under the agreement that that dedication would be a requirement. Another piece of this that we've had a long conversation with your county road department, city streets staff, and as well as some consulting engineers about the design and construction of the road. So you saw the street cross sections, and those cross sections are going to be in the plan. And we want to, through an adoption process, make certain that those are adopted as standards by both the city and the county, so that as development happens, we make certain that those cross sections are realized. But one thing along those lines is, do you put the actual street standards in the code, the zoning code, or do you have separate engineering standards where they fall in play, which is what they do now? So what's the better approach? We're not really certain about that. And then, so the big point I think that we've discussed at length internally with some of our stakeholders, and we need to, I think, discuss tonight, is about the paving of roads. Because right now, there are county subdivisions that are going in or have gone in recent past that have not been paved. And what we're saying with these new standards, that the paving would become the baseline standard. And that is a departure. And there are, I think, a host of reasons for that. There's obviously greater maintenance over the long haul. So either way you go, there's a lot of maintenance, whether it's gravel to be maintained or potholes to be filled or chip seal or milling and overlay, whatever it is. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. But that's something I think would be helpful to understand from your all's perspective tonight, whether you perceive it to be necessary, pardon me, to put paving as the new standard. There could also be some provisions, and we could imagine cases where you're at the furthest out from so basically the corners of the growth area, and you have a very rural subdivision. Might it be appropriate to put in gravel? That might be the case, but that would be more of an exemption that you would have to have, as opposed to saying the baseline is gravel, and then would you pave it? It's more like the standard is paving, and then maybe there's an exemption process given average daily trips. Maybe it's the density of the development. There could be a host of reasons, but that's something that I think we'd like to get some perspective from you all on. And if you look at where these roads would be, so the growth plan shows these roads are dashed. And it's really a reflection of the major street plan that's already adopted. So you have arterial roads and collector roads that are shown here, they're dashed. And our calculations are basically anticipating that the section that you saw would coincide with these alignments. Now, these alignments are not exact. There's some areas where they probably can be tweaked. It's really connecting point A to point B. on a lot of these areas. But you can see sort of the breadth of the road network that would have to be constructed in order to implement the plan. And again, it coincides with your master street plan alignments. So, next slide. So here are the cross sections. You've seen these before. So you have more rural cross sections. Think of the two on the left, upper left, that don't show curb and gutter. They're open that you typically would see in a rural area. And then you have to make transitions to more urban streets, which are the other ones shown there. Some are arterial, some are collectors. And we also have a local there. So the idea being that we would have this consistency within the growth area for the street cross sections, accommodating both depending on the context.
Would this anticipate that the dedication might be made for the arterials, but that the construction would depend on the density there and then further density beyond, or is it all or nothing?
No, it'd probably be incremental. And I think you've probably seen this in other places in Laramie. You see it across the country where the idea is that maybe you have an arterial that's going to have to be extended, or a collector that's going to be extended, and you don't have enough development around it to support it. So you would get the right of way. The critical thing is you don't want to encroach into that area. You want to have an understanding, but you may not build the ultimate street cross section for years. You might have an interim section. And you see that. I think of in my career many examples of that where a road goes in and it's designed at 2 lanes, ultimately to be 4 lanes. The main thing is to get the right of way. That is, you're sunk if you don't get the right of way. Later on is usually problematic. Getting property owners to either sell or dedicate right of way is difficult. I think you get opposition to a street being widened, for example, and never happens. I mean, that's the main thing, but it can be done incrementally in terms of the cross section. That's correct.
But your notion would be that even if it's just a 2-lane, no shoulder, it's paved. That's correct. That's the first step, and then we talk about it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, that actually answered one of my questions I was going to ask, because it seems exactly that the critical thing is right away, not the existing road at the time, which you can always make the road better or bigger or whatever.
Yeah.
But how are you suggesting these right of ways be secured?
A bit to hear the last part.
How are you suggesting these right of ways be secured?
So different ways, typically it's going to happen as a function of development. So developer comes in, they've got a parcel, it's got a collector roadway being shown through it. That would be dedicated and fee on the subdivision plat. It's right on the plat, there'd be dedication language. And that's another thing that came up last night was some questions about standardization of dedication language, which from our perspective is a relatively simple way there's ways to do that. You can come up with language that the county council and city councilors would find acceptable, and then you just standardize that, and subdivision plats that reflect the same language. There was a concern of a commission member last night that was concerned that there was inconsistent language sometimes in dedications. That's easy enough to address.
So the notion of reaching into the future is troublesome. A lot of my career has been in subdivision water supplies, and it's just classic that a developer comes in, makes elaborate promises, sells all the lots, and disappears. So how do you obligate as individual homeowners then that promise cross their hearts that they'll hook up to the sewer when it comes along, or it's a deed restriction that the city can enforce?
Yeah,
How does that
so,
work?
well, for a lot of communities, the standard is, procedure is this. The developer comes in, their development plan gets approved, it includes subdivision plat, plat shows where rights of way and easements are being dedicated to the public. There's a utility plan, says, okay, here's where the mains are gonna go. Here's how we're gonna service these lots. They commit to those improvements, they physically put them in, and then they get permits. So there's a sequence. So until the infrastructure is in, they don't pull permits, or there's a financial guarantee that's sufficient to cover the cost if the developer decides to walk away, that the purchasing lot owners would not be left holding the bag. So that, and there's a lot of ways to do financial guarantees.
So if I'm speculating that this will happen 10 years down the road, I bond it basically.
Correct. Right.
And then I build that into the cost of the lots, and that's how it works.
Yes, correct.
Would you anticipate that there was a mechanism for, let's say that I'm nearer to town. I do not want to pay for more than my development. What provision is or would there be for those services to continue on? In other words, that the system is correctly sized to extend, and what sort of financial, who would bear that financial burden, I guess is a way to put it. And I ask that reason because I'm still waiting for that other half of the road that I paid for pavement and curb and gutter on that has never yet been developed.
So I think there's a clear way that's commonly used to address that situation. So if you were to go back to that map, showed where the water and sewer mains are going to be extended. Imagine somebody's going to do a 100-lot subdivision, and it's not sized. And the main that's being shown on this, I'll call it system plan, is a larger diameter, because it's, like you said, it's going to perpetuate the system. It's going to keep going. It's going to be in a loop. It's going to go for miles. Often what would happen is that the developer would pay their pro rata share. Let's say, for sake of numbers, they are sized for 6-inch main, but to perpetuate the system, you need an 8-inch main. That the local utility would compensate them for the oversized section. So for that additional, so it's a 6-inch main, you got to go to 8 inches, that additional 2 inches of main, that oversizing would be paid for by the local utility. And frankly, that would, just like any utility improvements, that would have to get folded into, capital infrastructure that the city would maintain for water. That's the only fair way to do it. So this way, the developer is not paying for more than their fair share. And the system, and the whole system is at an advantage because they're getting, the developers downstream are getting advantage of 5 years, 10 years, they're going to hook in. And it's going to be bigger and it's going to help them. And then the city system is going to be at an advantage because they're building it out. Maybe it's creating a loop. It's, reducing the need for some other infrastructure because they've got the rate pressure and so forth. So that's probably the fairest answer of how you would address that. Pretty common. So we are really close, as I said, we've got a draft that we've been working on internally with the city and county team. We're getting very close, and we have all 3 components ready to be released. And after that, then we would be coming back. We don't have set hearing dates. We've been kind of kicking those around where we would be going out to the public and before City Planning Commission, you all, and then the two legislative bodies to take a look at the drafts and make a determination whether it's ready for adoption or appropriate to be adopted.
Question for David. Are the city and county planning teams working well together on this?
Yeah.
No big conflicts or anything?
We've never really had too many conflicts
Yeah,
over the time I've been here.
Well, I didn't think so, but I figured I'd ask anyway, it's good to know. And in general, with your professional expertise, is everything you're saying make sense?
Yeah, I mean, we're still discussing it, I think, with Simpson too. So, I mean, we're addressing our concerns. I think there's still things that we're working through. But,
Okay, we're good.
it's
I had a couple other questions I didn't ask as we went along, so
Sure.
forgive me if you have to scroll back. Where do special districts fit into this? I'm thinking of South Laramie, and I'm also thinking of some huge messes that are going on, particularly in the Casper area because of overlaps with special districts and multiple municipalities, and it's a mess.
Yeah. So the South District, we had the opportunity to meet with them very early on in the process, as well as our sub-consultant, Stantec Engineering. They conferred with them during this process of crafting the water and sewer system plan to make certain that we're not at odds with any of the work that they're doing. So we're absolutely confident, based on our conversations with them, that this would work as shown.
The other question I had was on the annexation, either requirement or agreement. And is there any specificity with contiguity? Is this corner, or is there anticipation of a percentage? And I'm thinking of some other places that I've worked
right.
where it was basically a minimum of 25% of the outer dimensions of the
Yeah.
parcel.
It varies by state. And in the state of Colorado, where, I spent a chunk of my career, it's 1/6 of the perimeter. The Wyoming statutes, though, does not specify other than contiguity. So our interpretation is that it is just that, it's any point. But there are other states that I've worked in as well, where it's 1/4. I've seen different percentages.
So, and Laura, sing out here, we can't see you on the screen, but let us know if you want to butt in at some point.
Yeah, no, I have a list of questions whenever it can, you're ready for my turn.
Let me just pursue one thing that was on my mind as we were listening to this last bit. It seemed to me that I'm asking, why do we need an agreement? Much of this is simply the county rising to the challenge of serving its constituents, which is everybody in the county, and to promote an orderly growth of our joint community. The county can certainly do that. And most everything you talked about, the county could do if it thought was in the best interest of the county. Again, understanding the county to include everybody in the city. So I'm asking, what do we need an agreement for? Which typically there's a kind of two sides are obligating themselves to something that the other side wants them to do. And that last thing was the first thing that tripped my trigger that way, that the city would be obligating itself to pay for the upsizing of utilities to make this thing go. So I would like to see an articulated list of what is the city giving to this process. And I think that would be useful in selling it to ourselves and to our constituents. So what else is on that list off the top of your
Well,
head?
you know, I would say that there's not a lot of sort of specific action that I can speak to. And I think more than anything, it's the basic parameters are, as we've said, is how does the annexation process work more specifically than what we have today, different than what we have today. It basically says that both parties will agree to the plan. And you could do, and there's other ways you could do it without an intergovernmental agreement. I mean, you could do a memorandum of understanding. There are other, techniques, or no agreement.
We, the county,
Could
could
be,
simply do all this.
Yeah, you can just do it without an agreement. And certainly that's clearly an option. I mean, if both parties agree that you don't want to enter into a binding agreement, then that would be that conversation. Hard to speak for either party, but I think starting this process, we anticipated that for the plan to endure over time, is that it would have to be something more than, hey, this is a good idea, but actually agree more formally that basically the parameters of the plan are something that would be upheld by both parties. I think that's the premise we were operating under since the beginning of this project. But ultimately, it's the legislators of the city and the county making this determination.
Sure, but I think that holds together better if there's the glue by way of mutual obligations. Otherwise, someone who was coming to this group to lobby against the plan would say, why are you ceding this authority to the city? If you think it's a good idea, just do it. Why do you need to promise in the future? So then it starts to sound like we're holding ourselves hostage, and there's no
Right.
point in that. But if
Yeah.
there are elements of it where the answer would be because the city is coming forward with dollars to facilitate the kind of development the county would like to see move forward, that starts to get some traction, it seems to me, in supporting that agreement.
Well, it's hard for me to speak for the details of the city. We haven't done the fiscal impact analysis, but just on the utility front, the county is not a utility service provider. The city is. And it seems to us that over time, as the area becomes more developed, that there's high likelihood that more of that water and sewer system that we saw earlier is going to be built. And the burden, a lot of that burden is on the city as an organization to build, maintain in perpetuity these systems. And so I think, it's hard for me as a consultant to speak for, the city. Just as it would be difficult for me to speak for the county. I mean, it's really up to the two parties to address the details. I think maybe to more directly answer your questions, probably be best for you all to see the draft agreement, to see the specific line items that are listed. I've, in this presentation, tried to sort of encapsulate the high points, which we think are the most critical. But, there are details in there that I think it's obviously any agreement is going to take a lot of thought going through each point, make certain that both parties find them acceptable. We took our stab at it based on, I think, what we've heard today.
There are three things I think of are adoption of this growth area plan will allow us to do a lot more actual planning within this area. It gives more powerful tools to work with in terms of what to accept or reject, what the county commissioner said, right? Sure. Anything which ultimately does get annexed to the city now becomes the city's responsibility. Think about police, fire, whatnot, freeing up county resources for further out. And I feel like Perry, I guess.
Well, but, I mean, but those can proceed without an agreement. And I'm not trying to lobby to.
Yeah,
not-
no, and I'm not trying to sell either, but I think having the planning tool of a growth area plan
Sure.
is a big plus for us. Oh, the third thing is going now. If we choose, this would allow us to actually incorporate and adopt a building code standard for this portion of the county, which I think is a good thing. Yeah, I think there we can go and ask the city for, some money to help, actually enforce the code. So those are three things that come to my mind. Again, I'm not trying to sell anything, but I see some advantages.
And Vern's comment a moment ago brought another question up in my mind. And what about existing subdivisions in the county that are already contiguous to the city? Because they have no obligation or need for an annexation agreement. So where do we proceed along the Cheyenne route and have those in holdings forever then?
Well, this came up actually at our commission meeting last night. So under Wyoming law, and we didn't get into this in the presentation, when you have an area that's completely surrounded 100%, those are considered an enclave. And they are not permitted with the state of Wyoming. So the city can just annex, go through there and initiate that procedure and annex. But that requires 100% encirclement. So if you're 99%, doesn't work. And we showed one example actually on that. If you go back to the map, there is one enclave within Laramie right now, in the north end of town.
Big hill.
Down the big hill, right, exactly. So if you look right there, there it is. And so, technically, that should be there if it was consistent with state law. And you can have this checkerboard pattern, and you've noted other communities that have it, where you have some, across the street from the city is the county, and then it's just the checkerboard. And from a jurisdictional standpoint, and a sort of service provision side, particularly if you think of like police service is a good one. Who responds? There's obviously a lot of reciprocal arrangements with the sheriff and the police department. But still, nonetheless, it's very confusing when you have this sort of a checkerboard pattern. And I think the statute is intended to not have these enclaves. But you could have situations, I think it's highly likely that you're going to have county subdivisions within this growth area that are not going to be annexed for a long time. They'll just be there. They won't be completely encircled, and they'll just stay in the same static condition. There'll be nothing to trigger annexation. If they're on, let's say, septic and well, they'll just stay on it. There's nothing within the IGA, within the code that we're talking about, that would force them to do anything. They would just be maintain status quo.
Laura, you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Cameron, for the presentation. And I've appreciated also the discussion that we've been having. But first, for a little comic relief, I do think it is funny that your acronym LAG could be in conflict with the city's economic development, which is to thrive. So I see those as opposites here. So anyway, I just thought that was a small bit of irony.
Can I interrupt for just 1 second about that? Because I found that funny. We actually had it in drafts recently as LGA. And because we had other references to Laramie area growth, it was determined, well, we should switch it to lag because it's sort of easier to say, but I had the same impression. I was a little, it was a little
It's gonna slow down the momentum. So one of the overall questions that I have is whether or not, well, whether or not this could possibly backfire. Like experimenting with annexing contiguous land upon development. Could some property owners who maybe already own a lot of land and really don't care if they develop or not, maybe totally opt out from the idea of developing because they don't want to be annexed out of some principle, or they don't want to be in for all that extra infrastructure cost and headache. And then I ask myself, how do you disincentivize all of the building that's going out in the county because there is less? It's sort of like, you know, some of the costs are hidden down the road, right? After you've been on a well and a septic system for so many engineered years, the homeowner's on the hook for dealing with the outcome. And the developer is long gone. And the developer, you know, there are developers in the county who I know the city has tried to court to come in and do development, and they won't develop in the city. They strictly will only develop in the county. So we have an imbalance already that seems to be attractive to developers to go further away from the city. And so I guess one overall worry I have is, could what sounds really like a great plan and good idea, could it have unintended consequences of discouraging development in these very areas, and then driving it out, you know, where we're trying to keep open space, however we define that. But so that's one overall concern. And then, you know, that ties in with, do you pave, do you not pave? You know, is that the straw that breaks the camel's back on a developer being willing to develop in the area? I don't know what the cost breakdowns are for a developer when they're taking all that into consideration. But it sounds like it's a narrower and narrower margin these days. So I just worry about it having an unintended consequence. And then lastly, regarding annexation, might there be cause to annex if groundwater standards are being exceeded, and it threatens public water supply system? Could that be a trigger for annexation? Have there been any triggers like that discussed outside of new development being a trigger?
We did not discuss using water quality as a trigger. That was not a topic that has been discussed with our team. I don't know what else to offer.
Okay, no, that's I guess another thing to ask, I know it's on the table earlier in the previous discussion about what instances might the city consider extending their utilities without requiring annexation. And you know, the Laramie Plains subdivision comes to mind as a place that probably is most currently threatening to the city public supply well, and more easily engineered to get to than, say, Sherman Hills. I'm just wondering if there's not instances where the city would see a benefit to themselves to protect their public water supply system by extending utilities without annexing.
I think the quick answer is that there is an out-of-city utility extension process, and that was the 100 feet that I mentioned. And it's at the discretion of the city. I mean, the city could extend water further out and not annex. And if there's no contiguity, they have no capacity to annex. So that's a possibility today. But that would be sort of, it's at the discretion of the city, and it would be up to obviously the property owner to want to help make that investment. But it's a possibility today. There's nothing really in the agreement that I think that would change that situation.
So the IGA wouldn't disallow a case like that.
That's correct. Yes, right. You would continue to have the out-of-city utility extension provision that the city offers today, but it's completely at their discretion.
And I would just add that this has been discussed with Logan Simpson and as well as the city. We've discussed, how this is going to look or how it could look. But yeah, like Cameron says, ultimately it's up to the city on whether they want to allow that policy to go into effect to allow that. So right now, my understanding from what's been conveyed to me, and I want to talk for the city, but I believe that properties have to be contiguous to the city to get water and sewer, and it usually is annexation that's required to get that as well. But yeah, with this plan, all these discussions are coming up or are kind of being vetted to see what may work and what may not work.
Well, I know, I'm sorry, I know the city regretted some of their extension of utilities in the past without annexation. But I guess I just worry that the pendulum has swung so far in the other direction of not even entertaining it as an option, because I think just to follow on to what Chair Hinckley said, I think, there's a lot that's being asked of the county here, and the more the city can do to step up and do what they can, especially to solve what's an obvious problem that is dragging along and could have a more immediate solution if the city were willing to think more generally about the benefits of extending utilities without annexation. So I guess you're right. It's up to the city on that, but I know that David can carry the message that there's stuff the city can be doing here to solve some of these problems. The county has a lot on our plates, and the county has a lot on our plates to try to address these subdivisions, and getting some help would be really great. Thanks. I think that's all I can think of on the general discussion. Thanks again for all the hard work that you're doing. And lastly, I wasn't alarmed by those dollar amounts that you threw out. I actually was surprised that they were that low, and I'm impressed. But I know you did highlight that it's today's dollars, and we're not going to see all that set aside now. But it's like the time to strike with all this infrastructure money coming out of the federal government. Usually they can't wait to get it on a project that's ready to go. So hopefully we'll be lining up at the right time for some of this. Thanks.
Thank you.
So just to follow up a little bit on what Commissioner Hanning was saying, the city does provide water to South Laramie Water District. Just metered at a point, they got water. They also provide water to 9 Mile and 7 Mile. So we certainly have precedent for that, but to just turn that thing around, maybe that's in my little bin of mutual obligations. Perhaps the county would like the city to consult with the county before they do that. So to Mr. Gertz's point of, that's up to the city. Well, maybe it isn't up to the city under this new cooperative agreement. So I would think that point ought to be part of this, at least consideration is that agreement. What can the city obligate to the county to help the county meet its goals?
And realistically, especially on the water infrastructure, if the city is going to pursue Water Development Commission, Water Development Commission will probably make that a condition that we want you to cover this area as they've done in several other areas in the state where they've actually done some rural districts as well. And they're not overly common, but there are instances where that has taken place. And I'm thinking of Bighorn and Park County in particular.
The Water Development Commission has had a nominal commitment to regionalization, but it's a commitment slides in a lot of cases. And we would suggest we need to correct that. I'm just saying if.
Well, they tend to enforce it when on larger some developments like this, if it was on any large kind of scale, and I'm Gillette and that huge project.
North Bighorn County,
Yeah.
South Bighorn County, sure.
If it's all right, I had another question or concern on the gravel versus pavement discussion, and I'm certainly on board on right-of-way widths, but I'm not overly fond of exemptions. And I would actually prefer that we have some sort of a rule where, at a certain size, below 5 lots or below 10 lots at a given distance from a already paved road, you can do gravel, but you have an obligation once it's grown up to much the same as the annexation agreement. In other words, we don't end up with a West Laramie where we've got curb and no pavement and things like that. But I don't like exemptions. I would much prefer that we had something written down as to where that's delineated and what future requirements there would be.
You're talking about trigger.
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is that the threshold would be relatively low for the gravel. You're saying it's very small. So, but most of the time, it's probably gonna be bigger than that, you would imagine, than they would be paved. Is that?
Well, and I'm thinking of the vast majority of the requests that we get here are for those smaller developments, 3 and to 5.
So early on, you suggested ways to incentivize the growths we want. And of course, we would all prefer the carrot to the stick. So can you elaborate a little more on what the county might offer by way of carrots to get things to move in the direction that this plan would envision?
Well, I think in part, if you look at the pattern of development, that, we have the areas that probably have the higher intensity, higher density, that they're closer to the built up parts of the city. And I think they're right there. The fact that you've got the ability to extend utilities, roads, you've got probably a higher return on investment on some of those parcels. I think of 30th and the interstate, for example, where, if that interchange were built, the tremendous value that you would have, occurring there between traffic counts, visibility, the fact that you have all those services right there. That, I think, alone is incentive. That's where I'd have to say that infrastructure investment would really promote and incentivize more growth to happen. So yeah, you can point to some other areas that are, I think, closer in to town where that's also the case. I think Sierra Sky is another one where you have streets stepping up to that area, you have utilities stepping to the area. You have a one larger property owner that probably has the wherewithal to be able to extend I think that's an incentive.
I guess I'd like to see that list well populated of things that the community could do to make it easier to develop this way. As a companion to the thou shalt aspects of it. But I like those kinds of examples because an I-80 interchange is something that would be a very, very large step. Would hugely increase the value of surrounding properties. So we would get nothing but applause for
Right.
for that kind of.
Yeah.
Cameron, I believe you said something about the boundaries of the growth area are being looked at, or that you're going to look at that again.
What, I guess, if you could bring up the map, I could just maybe reflect on it a little bit easier with the graphic to explain. Go ahead.
I'm not satisfied with growth area. Now, I'm only one person. I'm not obviously even a commissioner, but I believe there are some areas that should be included that aren't included.
Okay.
Before I get to that, I'd also like to ask and suggest, it looks to me like the boundary doesn't necessarily completely conform with existing boundary lines. And will it, in its final form, conform to existing boundary lines or not?
Are you talking about parcel lines?
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, so we have a defined place.
right.
That's
Well,
important.
Yeah, for the most part, it absolutely does.
Well, I'm looking at the curved lines.
There's a few, and I think, part of that there is based on the aquifer protection area and utility provision. In fact, the outer boundary in large part is based on utilities. So grades, it's based on the ability to actually put the utilities in because of the rocky conditions, for example, on the east end of town. It's not financially, in some cases, physically feasible.
Okay, let me backtrack.
Yeah, sure.
Let me go back to the boundaries.
Sure.
It should follow existing boundaries. I'm talking about property owners.
Property boundaries, yeah.
Okay, and it shouldn't dive across someone's property. Correct. We agree on that.
Yeah, I follow what you're saying. I think there's maybe a few places I'm just.
And I'm looking at the line, for instance, immediately northeast of the airport, for instance, because there's a curved line there, and it looks to me like it's cutting across, indicated parcels on there. And,
Yeah, in some places, that's actually the floodway line, there's a floodway, our floodplain line.
Yeah, and again, I can't speak for the rest of the commissioners here, but I absolutely believe it ought to follow an existing, identifiable property line.
Right, very good. Well,
Everywhere.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, appreciate it.
And then going back to my main point is, accepting and understanding this is a huge area. Don't accommodate decades of growth, centuries of growth. It still seems to me there are two places where it should include where it doesn't. And I'm thinking of the area north of the Laramie Airport as a place which is starting to develop right now. It's certainly conceivable to me if the community grows to some size, there could be substantial interest in commercial development there. And right now, that's not included in the growth area plan. And then even a more important area to me is a strip extending south along 287. Because there too, traffic counts are going up. Well, I don't have any evidence, hard numbers.
Yeah.
But anecdotally, traffic counts on
Yeah.
287 are going up year by year. And I believe that area, could potentially see quite a bit of development in the future to the south. If that's just my guess and speculation, but if we're drawing a map now, I would like to see the map include that.
Well, on the south area, just to sort of reinforce the monolith ranch ownership, that's pretty, it kind of wraps around the south end here, shown there in green. There are parcels even further south that are privately held.
Right.
So it would be kind of a sort of a leapfrog, like you'd have commercial, and you'd have open space, then you'd have the town again. So I think our thinking was you'd have kind of a hard edge to the community, really right where you have it today.
Well, I mean, obviously the city could sell some of that land if it wanted to for development. Or for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I mean, Bern, you were talking about, UW not being interested in doing anything, but they may change their mind. And all these property owners may change their mind or be willing to have their minds changed. So anyway, I have questions about those areas not being included. And again, I'm only one commissioner. We haven't talked about this at all, about where the map should be or if this is fine or not. But my opinion is it should be a little bit larger in some places. And this is my first chance I've had to say that.
And maybe that speaks to in your presentation, explaining where some of these natural boundaries fall.
Right.
And maybe that's already in your prose, but that would be pretty.
Yeah.
very
Yes,
displayed.
there's some physical constraints, and as topography, soils, floodplain, and then the utility service provision. And those are probably the four major components of sort of that perimeter boundary. But I appreciate your point about coinciding. with
And
property
I'll
lines.
also just add, the advantage to me of seeing a larger rather than a smaller Rosemary plan is if this is a good tool, if it ends up being a good product in the end, this will be to our advantage to have more territory to work with. Should we choose to? We don't have to, but if it's included in the area and it allows us to do certain things, then that's a tool we can pull out if we need to or want to at some point. And I'm thinking not today or tomorrow or 5 years from now, but a long way down the road. About things we really can't foresee today. But the idea that traffic's going to continue to go and grow on 287 as the front range continues to expand, it's right for 4-laning all the way down. And I think there could be high commercial interest down the road. I may be wrong though. I think I don't know more than anyone else, right? Those are my thoughts.
I mean, I think some of that flows out into the county comprehensive plan. Because what we're talking about following these guys' suggestion is taking that piece, making it an overlay and imposing regulations on it. And so some of this stuff that we might be thinking about in the long term, we certainly would not want at this point to take that major step of imposing new regulations on it. So there's kind of two things going on there. But picking up on part of that, it's like I've been waiting since we first started seeing these maps, just as a presentation. Maybe it's because my mind is not as expansive as some. I would like to see where we are now. Show us current county zoning. I mean, I can't put any more on that map, but it's another map. For example, we have areas that are zoned urban residential. That's one of our existing zones within the county. There aren't a lot of those, but I think it would help us get our minds into your plan if you were to show us where we start. And there's two components of that. One is, how is the county currently zoned in this area? Where are all the existing subdivisions? And as Commissioner Platt pointed out, we've just approved, 4 in my short memory out there north of the airport, between there and town, which kind of are right in that same area. So that I would help us get our minds around how this thing lies. And then the other thing that I find myself looking at this map and wondering is, what does the city look like when it's parsed into this same idea of commercial centers and high densities and low densities, instead of it just being this vast? I would find it useful to have that same color scheme and symbology extended into the city. Again, maybe that's obviously it's a separate diagram, but I could get my mind around this plan more readily if it started with where we are and then went from there. So just making the leap into the future.
Gotcha.
So, all right, those are the 3 things I'd like to see on your mapping. And showing all those little subdivisions, I think would be instructive as per Mr. Platt's comments. Kind of start populating that map in our minds, having dealt with those. So just a suggestion for how we present this thing. Maura, anything more from your end?
Well, I guess I would echo what Commissioner Platt said and what you've also said, that the areas north of the airport, it would be another case where I think the city would have to think about extending utilities, since we know the water isn't great out there for community wells or anything like that. But it seems well within the reach of the wastewater treatment plant. And it is an area that's easily accessible by state roads. I mean, it seems like building around existing infrastructure like the highway, maybe in the future there need to be another exit. I don't know, another exit that closes in the winter blizzards. But that does seem like an area that could handle the growth. Although I don't know what Cameron mentioned earlier about floodplains and erosional features and how they factor into this area. Thanks.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just maybe add some clarification. So, and I think we're kind of wrapping our minds around this. This is what this plan is its purpose is to show how the city is going to grow out into the county. To go to your point, Mr. Platt, and I think you mentioned too, this is just for that growth that's coming out into the county. And so there are going to be barriers to that growth. I mean, so like that area that Cameron was talking about with, it's all green over there, that's agricultural. I mean, the city really can't grow into that. There's wetlands, there's the river, there's floodplains. And there is a kind of a deadline to the plan too. I don't know, have we put a deadline to the plan? Or is it like a 30-year plan or a 25-year plan?
20 years.
20-year
Yeah.
plan. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, is all this area going to be filled with houses and businesses in 20 years? Absolutely not, you know? But we don't know exactly how that's going to take shape. So I don't know, I guess when we're talking about boundaries and those types of things, I think we need to wrap our minds around that. What is this plan for? How far is the city actually going to grow out into the county? Or how far could it potentially grow if we kept growing at a, specific rate? Yeah, I just wanted to throw those comments in just to make sure that we're kind of focused and on topic on what we're talking
Oh,
about.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But rubber meets the road when you draw a line for this growth
sure.
area overlay.
And that's why I'm asking,
That's gonna be a
right?
hard line that the rules change when you do that going forward. So again, we need to.
Right.
We're just presented with a map. We didn't have a hand in drawing the boundaries at all.
Right.
We don't necessarily know why, the boundaries are where they are. And, so therefore, if I think the boundaries ought to be a little different, I'll speak up, which I did.
But I guess just not to gloss the fact that this is a very large step.
Yeah.
In terms of what county zoning resolution looks like.
And for Cameron's edification, so those, can you see where my cursor is here?
Yes.
This is where we're kind of seeing a few lots being divided out
Right.
here. So that's what Commissioner Hanning and others have been talking about. So not like huge subdivisions, but we do have like lots.
It's not at all. Yeah. And it's just a question of if Laramie does grow, if Laramie doubles in size, there's gonna be a lot more traffic out the airport. And airport's a logical place to have other commercial development as things move out that way, or that general vicinity. That's all I'm thinking about. Right now, if you look at that whole big swath of land north of 130, between 130 and interstate, there's only about a dozen buildings out there right now. 3 years ago, I think there's maybe one. And we actually, on this, as you pointed out, on this commission, have seen a number of applications this year for some out there. If you go back 15 years in time, the area southeast of town where all these ranchettes are now, it wasn't empty, but it's really populated this past 15 years. And obviously it will happen elsewhere also.
Could you just elaborate a little more on the not changing the underlying zoning that makes this overlay? I missed that distinction. What are the pros and cons?
The existing zoning, as you were just referencing, and these new use categories, they're going to be embodied in your zoning resolution or on top. So the parcel that is contiguous to the city, that property owner walks in to county planning department says, we're gonna do a 10-lot subdivision. And the application of that pattern of development is gonna be based on this plan. And that code section is gonna reflect the various categories. So we actually have numerics, just like you have in your code today, for all of these different categories. So minimum lot size, for example, the kind of use that you can have on the lot, that would be dictated by this pattern of development.
But why not just zone it a state level and just go right down your list and zone it that way? I don't understand why you do overlay zone instead of
So-
just changing your underlying.
Yeah, because that would be a arduous task. And it would be very controversial. It doesn't, I don't think it really reflects sort of the incremental nature of the change that's going to happen. So let's say you had a parcel that is presently,
Well, agriculture is what probably, that's what we see is people come to
say,
us. to zone the
agricultural zone, and they come in and you say, okay, the designation on the plan is suburban residential. And here are the development standards within that overlay. And they would say, okay, I'm gonna walk down from the county office, I'm gonna walk to the city, and I'm gonna annex, and that's basically the pattern of development that you're gonna see.
So we would not say, oh, the first thing you have to do is ask for zoning change to urban residential.
You wouldn't be rezoning, no.
Rezoning at all, because
You would not
you're
be
annexing.
not rezoning at all. Well, for those that are annexing, that's separate. I probably muddied the conversation by making that comment. But let's say they're not contiguous and they came in. You're still talking about the overlay zoning prevailing over the underlying zoning.
To some extent, it's kind of a distinction without a difference. There, you're doing, it allows you to get to the same place piecemeal. Is that the?
Correct.
Is that what we're
Yes,
doing?
that's right. That's exactly right. So instead of going in and saying, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to rezone the urbanizing areas of the county within this growth area, we're going to rezone them to each of these categories. We're saying no, only when there's change will basically be the implementation of the plan.
But we will commit going in that if you meet these criteria.
Correct. Right. They're the set of standards, just like you have standards today. These are a new set of standards that are overlaid. And then that's what you would follow when that development plan came in for the county's approval. If you actually look at this map, think of the south part of town, where you can see the size of the lots. We purposefully tried to match, to the extent sort of that we can reasonably feasibly do it, match up the size of the lots and the types of subdivisions with this pattern. So we're saying, all right, the paddocks, it has a certain lot size. The designation for the paddocks on this plan basically matches what's built today. And we try to be respectful for what's on the ground, the investments that people have made, acknowledging that some other areas are going to change more dramatically than others. So the ones that are going to change most dramatically are the ones that are, quite frankly, closer in. So you can see, if you look at both the colors and the gradient, basically, you're going to see the highest intensity and density of development closer in and lesser as you get further up. This is just a general rule, and that there's areas more at the fringe are highly reflective of what's either built today or trending to be built.
So just to one more pass through it, get in my mind. So I've got a developer, I come in and I say, I want to build a 5-lot subdivision or a 5-acre lot subdivision here. And I need it, it's currently zoned ag. And then we would say, well, if it meets this, you're on your way. If it doesn't, then we're gonna have a long talk and see where.
That's
you can
exactly
justify
right.
it.
Yes.
So there's your incentivizing this.
That is
direction.
exactly right.
And I'll just add, I was a little confused by the whole concept, but Melissa finally got it through my head, so, in our,
You're a good hand.
It's not an easy concept, and it's similar to the way that the APOZ functions as an overlay, just a little bit more complex,
yeah,
but it functions similarly. And it's modeled kind of after the way that the APOZ kind of functions.
and so one of my questions was, it's like, well, how do we do the land use table with all of this? Well, the land use table is connected with the base zoning, right? So if somebody came in and was in this area and they want to do something that's already allowed with their zoning on that use table, they can still do that. It's just when they come in, they want to develop it into more lots, that's when, okay, now we got to look at this and see what they want to do, and then it has to comply with that.
Which, in my mind then, so what about conditional uses allowed in the underlying zoning?
Yeah, conditional uses, I don't think would be affected. I think it was just the maybe zoning changes and subdivision. Is that what we were?
Yeah, so the intent was that this would apply at the time of subdivision or zone change. Really, the trigger is subdivision. If you're subdividing your lot,
Right.
this is when this comes into place. And we're still kind of working through the way that the code, the tables and the pieces within that overlay zone and how they function. But you still have within each of these standards a lot size, like the types of uses you want to see. But basically this allows you, without using, I'm gonna use the word no one likes, to upzone specific portions of the county to get the density and intensity you want that aren't allowed in that underlying zoning. So you're allowing an increased amount of different types of development. So looking at, say, the area right around that interchange, that's definitely not zoned for the type of intensity that the overlay would provide for. So that's your incentive, is that you get a larger amount of kind of development you can do versus your underlying zoning.
So would there be merit in reaching down into our existing zoning and trimming some of those conditional uses and so forth, simply to promote this notion?
We've already given them a moving target anyway.
Yeah, I think that's kind of outside of this, you know, we want to leave the land use table, I think, go the way it is, but that's a good project for us.
Well,
You want a third one right now?
I'm kind of singing your song, Commissioner Kennedy, and let's bring as much kind of clarity and there's a little just fuzziness as we can to the process. I'm wondering if that's another place to do that.
Matt had it.
Mr. Chair, thank you.
David, with this overlay zone and implementation of the growth plan, is that going to run afoul of requiring development to comply with a local land use plan?
No, so we will, when we adopt the actual regulations into our regulations, we are going to adopt this overlay as well as part of the regulations. So we're not referring to the plan in any way. It will all be adopted in code.
And there will be like text provisions for
Yes,
each of these sort of micro
Yes.
zones?
yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, so there'll be metrics that are assigned to each one of these use categories.
So with this project, there's three things. We've got the plan, we've got the code, and we've got the intergovernmental agreement. So
Cameron, how will, potential modifications to this be incorporated into the agreement, or will that be contemplated?
Yeah, we've got some provisions already within the IGA. We have text, and then we also have text in the code. Speaks to the amendment process. So it's in the plan. I think we've got it in every place.
It's not in the code now,
It's in the code. I'm sorry.
it's at the
It's in the
the end of
plans.
the plan. Just like how you would, it's the same as how you would update your comprehensive plan. You come back in 5 years and see how it's working and you can amend it at that time. That's just the plan itself. The IGA has the same, I think it's similar language, but the
Similar
same-
language.
same process. That you'd update them together through the similar process that we're going through right now jointly with the city. So that's where, if you're looking at 287 in 25 years and you want to include that in the plan, that would be kind of your best mechanism to do that in a comprehensive manner.
Looking forward to reading all the gory details. This is fascinating.
Thank you, and we look forward to getting you the working draft here very shortly.
And I'd echo what Commissioner Henning said, your numbers don't seem daunting at all in terms of, I'm encouraged as you suggested that one could accomplish this from an infrastructure point of view within those kinds of budgets. So it's doable. Others? Sandy?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess one last curious question. For some of these larger property owners in this area, has there been outreach and discussions with them about like their thoughts about this?
Yes, we've had the opportunity to speak with the three, well, if you include the university, the 4 largest property owners within the growth area. And they have seen the recommendations and approve of the direction.
Great. Well, that's wonderful. I just previously thought from Mr. Taney that we had some large parcel landowners who were happy to wait for other people to do all the heavy lifting on infrastructure. And I hope those people come around to helping with the lifting. But thanks for letting me know that. Thanks. I appreciate all of this presentation and discussion. It's a complex problem to pair up with the growth that the city is aiming for. This is a really important piece of that economic development. Where are you going to put the people that you're trying to attract here? And I really appreciate the careful thought that you've been putting into it. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we have no other public, am I understanding my screens correctly? Okay, so looking down the hall, hearing none, seeing none. Any objections to calling this an adjourn?
So moved and
Okay, done. We are adjourned. Thank you very kindly.